Two accidents. The first was a fall down a flight of stairs. The second, a car crashing into a guardrail in the early morning hours. And for a while, that's exactly how they were treated. Unfortunate and coincidental, but nothing more. Until someone started asking questions, and the answers were evidence of a much darker design. Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're here because if you weren't here, you'd be somewhere else. I want to give a quick thank you to all who are financially supporting the channel. And if you're interested in throwing in a few dollars a month to support my work, there are links in the description box for becoming a member. I prefer Patreon because they're about 20% less greedy. Now on with our story. In the early morning hours of July 15th, 2008, Pastor Arthur Schirmer was rushing his wife Betty to the hospital, who was experiencing jaw pain. While driving up Route 17 in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, a deer suddenly ran onto the road, causing Arthur to swerve and hit the guardrail. Betty, who was usually a stickler about wearing her seatbelt, had taken it off just before the accident to make herself more comfortable. She was taken to Lehigh Valley Hospital, Cedar Crest, and it was determined that she had a skull fracture, facial fractures, and brain damage. Arthur was unharmed. Betty was taken off of life support and died at 12:12 the next morning. She was cremated the following day without an autopsy being performed. Her death was ruled an accident, and her memorial service was held on Saturday, July 19th. Arthur and Betty had been married for 7 years and had moved to the Readers community in Jackson Township, Pennsylvania, just a month after they were married. Jackson Township is in Monroe County and is nestled or otherwise stuck in the Poconos. Why are towns and mountains always nestled? Why not? Jackson Township was crammed right in the middle of the mountains. Arthur had taken the position of pastor at the Readers United Methodist Church, and they lived in the parsonage behind the church and had a seemingly happy life. But as we all know too well, sometimes that happiness is a facade. Still, obladi oblada life goes on, at least for Arthur. He was still standing before his congregation every Sunday morning, smiling, calmly giving his sermon for the week. But there was one parishioner who was listening more intently than the others. Perhaps she slipped him a sly, knowing smile as he sermonized the Psalms. A little over 3 months later, something occurred at the church on the corner in Readers. On the morning of October 29, 2008, an emergency call was made. There was a man dead in the church, slumped over the desk of Pastor Arthur Schirmer. But when Trooper Philip Barletto arrived at the church, he discovered that the body in the pastor's chair wasn't that of the pastor, but rather that of Joseph Louis Musante, a regular church attendee. There was a .380 Beretta on the floor beside the desk, and Joseph had a single gunshot wound to the head from that gun. His death was ruled a suicide, and the evidence never suggested it could be anything but that. A window had been broken out at the church, and there were glass shards in the soles of Joseph's loafers he was wearing that night. But why would he commit suicide, and why do it in the office of the church, sitting at a desk that he had built himself for the pastor? Well, Joseph's wife, Cindy, had the answer for that, and Cindy just happened to be Arthur's administrative assistant. She told Trooper Barletto that Joseph had left the evening before and that he'd had a gun. She knew he was headed to the church. When asked why, she told the Super Trooper that her husband suspected the pastor of having an affair with one of the church members. Well, either Joseph was very serious about the pastor having affairs, or Joseph had a personal interest in the affair, which he did. Cindy confessed that she had been having a dilly-dally with the Arthur Preacher's fish and chips. And for those of you who have never had an Arthur Preacher's fish and chips restaurant near you, you have no idea what that last pun was about. Anywho, stop rambling on your dumb side quest, lady, and get back to the story. So Cindy was having an affair with the pastor, and as his assistant, could it be a more stereotypical affair? But no worries, gentle listener. Cindy explained that it was just an emotional affair. I don't believe her. Cindy said that the emotional affair had commenced after Betty had died. She was consoling the Good Shepherd, and before she knew it, her consoling became emotional foreplay or something of the sort. She was simply helping him grieve, which I admit is a euphemism I've never heard before. Oh, wait, yes, I have. That's what the now wife of Pastor John Paul Miller from Myrtle Beach, Susie Skinner, said when she was caught at a bar with John Paul only days after his wife had allegedly committed suicide. She was just helping him grieve. Well, these pastors and their need for grief counseling at the hands of one of their female congregants is quite the phenomenon. A little over a week after Joseph's death, Arthur was relieved of his duties as a pastor by the United Methodist Church. He would tell people that he's retired, but it was more of a forced retirement. A local bishop complained to the Southwest District of the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference of the United Methodist Church, and they told Joseph that either there was going to be a church trial about his affair, or he could surrender his credentials. So Joseph surrendered. He then quickly moved out of the parsonage and right in with Cindy, into the house that Joseph had built. And what an utter slap in the face to Cindy's children and the memory of their father. They lose their father, and their mother's emotional boy toy moves in. Joseph's sister, Rose Cobb, wasn't having any of the nonsense. She knew something hinky was happening. She knew about the affair and insisted that investigators dig deeper into Betty's death. So they did, and what they discovered began to untangle a web of deception that Arthur Schirmer had started to weave years before. Investigators took another look at the photos from the accident that early July morning, and what they found was that Arthur's story of driving around 55 miles an hour was a big fat lie. The damage on the car was minimal. It didn't match a high-speed collision. There were no skid marks, and the airbags hadn't even deployed. It was determined that Arthur was driving at a low speed when he hit that guardrail, and they began to suspect that the deer was only a figment of Arthur's imagination. When blood analysts looked at the photos of what was now considered a crime scene, they saw that the blood pattern didn't match someone being injured in a vehicle accident. There was also a major injury on the side of Betty's head that didn't correspond to anything in the car. And when the investigators went back to the parsonage and looked in the garage, they found Betty's blood on the floor, more than a spot or two. And Betty's sister told investigators that Arthur had given her a different story about why Betty didn't have her seatbelt on that morning. He said that she'd begun playing a game where she would get in the car without her seatbelt on and would wait to see how far down the road they would get before the car would start sounding the seatbelt alarm, and then she would put it on. Well, that sounds like a not safe game and not one that someone who was a staunch seatbelt user would play. Besides, where the accident happened was almost a mile and a half from the parsonage, so the seatbelt alarm would have gone off long before they made it to the accident scene. What a completely stupid story to make up, Arthur. With all the evidence they'd compiled, police now believed that Betty had been bludgeoned in the garage before Arthur placed her in the car and faked the accident. He purposely didn't put the seatbelt on Betty because he thought that would lend credence to her cause of death being from the accident. The coroner changed the cause of death on Betty's death certificate from accidental to homicide. For the next 2 years, investigators and prosecutors slowly built their case against Arthur. In the meantime, he and Cindy were still playing house, and in the summer of 2010, Arthur bought Cindy a ring, and Cindy, obviously being devoid of any firing synapses, said yes. One of Cindy's daughters was worried for her mother. She didn't like the idea of Cindy becoming the third Mrs. Schirmer and possibly dying from another accident. So she went to investigators and asked them if they could maybe just scooch their investigation along. And they did. On September 13th, 2010, police showed up to Cindy's house to arrest Arthur. She blocked the driveway with her car and asked them to, please don't do this here. Oh, how noble. But they did do it there. And while one officer went to the front door, a second went to the back. And as soon as the officer at the front door knocked, Arthur hot-tailed it out the back door, straight into the arms of the second police officer. It was almost like a scene from a romantic movie. Arthur tried to make the excuse that he was going for a run. Well, I'll bet you were, Artie. One of those runs where you don't stop until you get out of the country. Arthur was then arrested for the murder of Betty. Here's a video clip from that day, and is it just me, or does this slimy bastard look like he's enjoying the attention of the media?
Reverend, are these charges true? Did you do this?
Anything you want to say about the allegations against him?
Please advise not to make any comments.
Sure, what do you want to say to the people in the church maybe looking at this and saying?
And again, please advise not to make any comments.
What's the
Counsel?
history of your past wives, Arthur? This suspicious, things are saying?
And again, he's been advised not to make any
charge.
comment.
What about first wife? Questions around that? No. This spouse? You sure you want to say anything else?
There's nothing in these questions to say.
While Arthur sat in jail awaiting trial and making all kinds of new friends, investigators weren't just finding evidence to charge him with the death of his second wife. They were also looking for evidence to charge him with the death of his first wife. That's right, Arthur had been married before to a woman named Jewel, and they lived in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, where Arthur was the pastor at Lebanon United Methodist Church and Jewel was a music teacher. They had been married for 30 years and had 3 grown children. Jewel died in April of 1999 at the age of 50, and her manner of death was officially listed as undetermined. According to Arthur's account of the day that Jewel died, he had been out jogging, and when he got back home, he found Jewel at the bottom of the stairs, the cord of a vacuum cleaner around her leg. He thought it was obvious that she had tripped on the cord and fallen down the stairs. Well, the medical examiner at the time thought differently. He told investigators that her injuries were more severe than what you'd expect from someone falling down the stairs, and he urged investigators to look into it, but they didn't. And it doesn't seem as though any of the investigators paid attention to the EMTs who had responded to the call when they noticed, even though it was raining outside and Arthur was supposed to have been jogging, his clothing was dry. They also noticed that Arthur was strangely calm about Jewel's injuries. An interesting note about Jewel's obituary is that the first paragraph read, Jewel V. Shurmer, 50, of 915 Skyline Drive, died Saturday at Hershey Medical Center of natural causes. Now, who do you think more than likely wrote her obituary? It seems as though maybe Arthur had an agenda and a narrative to push. So it took 10 years and the death of another wife before Jewel's death was investigated. And this time around, the investigators paid attention to what the medical examiner had said about Jewel's death. The forensic pathologist determined that the skull fracture that Jewel had would have required at least 750 pounds of pressure, which wouldn't happen with a fall down the stairs. It would have had to have been from blows to the head by something like a crowbar. He also determined that there were 14 separate impact injuries to her head and face, as well as numerous abrasions and contusions. Investigators also noticed that the injuries to Jewel's head and those to Betty's head were almost identical. So Jewel's manner of death was changed from undetermined to homicide, and in September of 2012, Arthur was charged with her murder. His trial for Betty's death began on January 8, 2013. Arthur decided it would be a good idea to testify, and he came up with a new story about the accident. He said that he had swerved a few times and was trying to hold Betty still with his free arm. And the blood that was found on the garage floor was from when he and Betty were moving firewood from inside the garage to outside in the yard. And while they were moving it, a pile of firewood fell and cut Betty's arm. But evidence from the investigation showed that there was a trail of blood that led right to the passenger side of the car. And that firewood that Betty supposedly helped move outside, well, it had newspapers at the very bottom of the stack that had been published after Betty's death. So she couldn't have helped stack that firewood outside. Arthur also testified about the choice of an urn for Betty's ashes. Now, why would that come up in a hearing? Because Arthur had chosen an urn with a deer on it. A deer, the animal that supposedly caused her death. So either Arthur is particularly malicious or he's an idiot, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say both. He said that the only reason he picked that particular urn was because Betty liked deer and he thought it would be meaningful. Oh, it was meaningful, all right, you prize putz. He also admitted that he looked at porn and cheated on his wife and lied about it. Just your average pastimes for a Methodist preacher. It took less than 2 hours for the jury to find Arthur guilty. His 2 daughters and Cindy, the emotional fiancée, cried. But Betty's son, along with numerous members of her family, rejoiced. Arthur showed no emotion. On March 18, 2013, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His trial for the murder of his first wife, Jewel, was scheduled for October 2014, but Arthur decided he didn't want another trial. On June 30th, 2014, he walked into the Lebanon County Courthouse and stood before Judge John Tilwalk and entered a no-contest plea to murder in the third degree. His daughters and Cindy were there to support him, still believing in his innocence. On September 10th, 2014, Arthur was sentenced to 20 to 40 years to be served consecutively to his life sentence. Arthur filed an appeal on the conviction of Betty's murder on the following grounds. The prosecution discussing information about the investigation into Jewel's death shouldn't have been allowed. His affair with Cindy shouldn't have been allowed. Police altered digital photos of luminol in the garage floor. Police executed search warrants based on misstatements and omissions of fact, and that he was denied to have a witness testify on his behalf. And that witness would have been a hairdresser who would have testified to cutting Jewel's hair just hours before her death and not noticing anything strange. Well, I don't even know what that last one's supposed to mean. If Arthur was trying to push the narrative that Jewel fell down the stairs, I don't know how in the heckety heck her appearing to be normal hours before her death would mean diddly squat. And why would that matter in his trial for Betty's murder? The Superior Court denied his appeal. Arthur appealed his conviction again in 2017, and again he was denied. Cindy has moved and is now the vice president of a popcorn company, and I haven't found any information to show that she still visits Arthur or considers him her fiancé. And Arthur is now spending his days at the Greene State Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison for men in Greene County, which is crammed into the far southwest corner of the state. He is spending his days slowly morphing into Megamind and avoiding being shanked or otherwise impaled by some guy named Hog Daddy. Thank you so much for being here. Please hit the like button and leave a comment so the big giant algorithm that lives in the belly of YouTube will think that more people should have a listen. I'll be back soon with more true crime. Until then, stay safe and be happy.